Rory Stewart turns up on his little podcast and reveals that his wife has just been robbed of $1 million because he runs something called Turquoise Mountain, which for some reason gets money from USAID, the European Commission, giving grants to the likes of Friends of the Earth. This is why I call it sock puppets. This government lobbying the government. It's obviously corrupt, right? Now you've got a department for everything. I think there's a minister for loneliness and all sorts of things. Is there anything great about manufacturing per se, and should we bring it back in a kind of 19th century sense? No, not at all. We actually manufacture a lot more than people think we do. We just don't employ that many people to do it, which is generally the root of prosperity.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Comms here at the IEA. Today I'm joined by our Head of Lifestyle Economics, Chris Snowdon, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. So there's been a lot going on this week, as always, but let's start with the simple question: should there be a British DOGE? Chris?
Well, there is, isn't there? Because Rachel Reeves created the Department for Government Efficiency or something like that, which I haven't heard any more about since she announced it, other than that the person put in charge of it had previously been running HS2. Yes. So someone who knows all about being efficient for the government. I will see what happens with that. I imagine I'll spend lots of money on doing anything, but who knows? We do. In terms of the question properly, there is a huge number of people who are getting money from the state for reasons that it's not quite obvious why they're getting it. Now, the classic example here, of course, is Rory Stewart's wife. So USAID was cut completely. Naturally, a lot of people who were beneficiaries of this aid, in terms of being like Westerners who were distributing it, were saying this is terrible and it's going to lead to famines and to kids going blind or what have you. And no doubt there will be a kind of a bleeding stump aspect to this. So, not all this money would have been wasted. But then Rory Stewart turns up on his little podcast and reveals that his wife has just been robbed of $1 million because he runs something called Turquoise Mountain, which for some reason gets money from USAID. And Rory Stewart was on the podcast saying, it just went just like that. Well, we were expecting another $1 million and now we'll never get it. It's like, yeah, brilliant. If that's the case. But it straight away undermines the idea that this is essential funding. And, I've written loads of stuff about this in the past, just specifically looking at publicly funded pressure groups. So we're quite a narrow part of it. I'm not looking at all the creative industries who are making a fortune. I'm not looking at all the research grants that go out to people to research ridiculous things. Other people have looked at that kind of stuff. I'm just looking at one narrow aspect. And even that was unfathomably large. Just the amount that the EU gives to these groups, let alone the domestic governments, it's just incredible. It is an endless, almost bottomless pit. What the whole budget adds up to across the board, it's impossible to know, but it's not trivial. I mean, sometimes people say, it's not that much money, it's just a £200,000 grant to research is rubbish. You add it all up, there's a huge number of these kind of quangos, NGOs, not really producing any services for people. This is not just outsourcing of essential services in the same way we pay a hospice, for example. These are just either they're pressure groups or they're ideological groups, or they're just people who came out of university with a fairly worthless degree but with a high sense of entitlement and think that somehow they belong to the natural aristocracy of the 21st century, and they manage to find bureaucrats in all sorts of corners of government who will dish out money to them. They're unproductive. It's a waste of the taxpayers' cash. We need a DOGE to get these people out of these jobs and into gainful employment.
This has been a problem. You said yourself, you've written loads and loads about it. The taxpayers' allowance has existed for ages. Christian, this has been a problem for so long. Why is it? Should we have any hope that we could do something about it, or is it just a perennial problem of all states and governments that there will just be a high degree of random wasteful spending?
It's a bit of both. So it all depends on what you think DOGE is supposed to do. I've said right from the start, if the idea is that you send in Elon Musk or some private sector entrepreneur into a government department with the mission of making it work like the private sector, then that's not going to work. Then you get into the Ludwig von Mises problems that we talked about before, that bureaucracies simply don't work in the way in which a private company does, because you cannot measure, because you have no profit and loss account or no equivalent of that, and you can't have that. There is no objective way of working out whether they work efficiently or not. And therefore, a certain degree of inefficiency is just inherent in the public sector. However, if a British DOGE or the American DOGE or any institution of that kind, if it means that you just draw up a list of activities that a certain public sector agency does, and you just ask yourself which of these are essential and which are not, and you just eliminate the ones where you can clearly say, we don't want the government to do this, then why not? Ideally, this is something that you wouldn't need a DOGE for, but this should be something, say, the pressure groups that you identified, that you've written about in your papers. Okay, ideally, of course, they should never have been state-funded in the first place, because these are just groups that have particular political opinions, and they're entitled to have those. But there's no reason why people who don't agree with those opinions should be forced to subsidize them. And I remember when, I think it was your first self-profit paper, when that came out, I was at an event at some university where somebody came to me afterwards and said, your colleague Snowdon is trying to silence us. And I said, no, he just doesn't want to pay your salary, because you're not paying his salary either. And it is really that sort of thing. And sub-profit or state-funded pressure groups are one thing. You could in principle argue that, I know this is a cliche, but DEY departments within the public sector are basically the same thing, even though that they are integrated into some larger organization, but they are essentially promoting a political ideology. And there are something like 10,000 DEY staff in the public sector. Well, that was the last figure I saw from a couple of years ago. It's almost certainly more now. Now, these are clearly things where you could say, well, okay, if we get rid of those functions, what exactly, what is the output that we're going to miss? Because there it's quite clear from, just from comparing companies or other organizations that had these programs to the ones that don't have them, what are supposedly the positive effects? It's not that these programs somehow make people more tolerant or anything. If anything, this is quite the opposite. They just make everyone more nervous about what they can say and what they can't say. And if anything, it's a net negative, and then you probably have second order effects from this, that people engage in behaviors they wouldn't otherwise have engaged in. So there was a survey, I think it was it Eric Kaufman or someone like that, where you just ask people who have taken part in say an unconscious bias training course, and you ask them later, would you feel uncomfortable providing critical feedback to a colleague who is not white? And people who have done those courses, of course, do say, yes, I would be uncomfortable because I'd be called a racist. It's just that sort of effect where you just make an organization less effective than it would otherwise have been. It's a net negative in every way. These are things that you can quite clearly say, this is a political choice to promote these various ideologies, and you could simply not make that political choice. Ideally, you wouldn't, as I said, need a DOGE-type department for that. It should just never have happened to begin with. But okay, it's just a sector where I guess that kind of rot sets in if it's not constantly monitored, and if the result of a kind of reset, a kind of stock taking, would be to identify those activities and say, let's not do that anymore, then fair enough. In the private sector, it happens more naturally where, there was a time when a lot of private companies were also setting up their own in-house wokery departments, and because they thought, okay, this is the fashion right now, we have to do this in order to signal to BLM or various other activists that we're not the main baddies, so that they pick on our competitors rather than us. But they are quicker to detect whether the winds are changing or not. And in the private sector, you do get a much quicker response to
Go work, grow broke.
Well, okay, in the extreme case that, or simply a realization that maybe they don't have to do that anymore. And then if they don't feel obliged to, they immediately stop doing it. So it was never driven by an honest conviction. It was just a pure naked opportunism. They realize, okay, some companies have come under intense social media pressure and pylons, as long as BLM was still as culturally powerful as they were, and thought, okay, let's preemptively invest in some in-house wokery program. But now that I feel they no longer need to do that to the same extent, they immediately stop doing it. In the public sector, it doesn't work that way. There, you need to make a conscious choice of defunding those in-house institutions, and that is just the way you have to do it.
Yeah, so the bloat that comes out of whatever is the cultural zeitgeist stays in the public sector in a way that does in the private sector. Because could you just take us through, just to rewind back a bit to Christian mentioning your piece, Sock Puppets, from a short while ago. Could you just give us a quick run-through of what your overall argument in that was and how that shapes up now?
The basic argument was there are lots of groups. In that particular first paper, I just focused on public health groups and environmental groups. But in both cases, the activist campaign groups, whatever you want to call them, were predominantly and sometimes entirely funded by various wings of the state. They were not just there to lobby for controversial or unpopular policies. They were there to change public opinion. And that's why this kind of stuff it's not just about waste, it's about democracy, really. This has come up again in recent months in the EU, because as I said before, the scale of funding of so-called NGOs and civil society groups is just off the scale at the EU level, particularly when it comes to environmental issues. And this is something that MEPs have finally picked up on, and they're not very happy about it. So there's been some controversy about the European Commission giving grants to the likes of Friends of the Earth, but a whole host of similar organizations, with the specific proviso in the contract that they use the money to lobby MEPs. Right? This is why I call it sock puppets. This government lobbying the government. It's obviously corrupt, right? As far as most people can understand.
So
exactly. Yeah. The purpose of it is to create a more extreme, essentially astroturf voice, saying the European Commission is going for net zero by 2060 or whatever. It should be 2035. And then the politicians go, "Oh, that's a bit extreme, but we'll make it 2040." It's a game. It's taking policies that are not very popular in the first place and making them even less popular. But you've got these grandstanding groups cheerleading for this stuff, and that is those people that MEPs hear from and the public hears from. Now, the justification for this kind of behaviour by the European Commission over the years has always been that, well, we have a lot of lobbyists, commercial lobbyists in Brussels representing fossil fuel industry, for example, and we need to balance out by supporting some of these other groups. I don't think this is a serious argument, because no doubt there's lots of lobbying in Brussels. Obviously, if you're going to keep producing laws at the rate that they do in the EU, you're going to have a lot of lobbyists around. And it is true that civil society, ordinary people, they need some kind of resources in order to speak out to politicians. But actually lobbying an MEP is not an expensive business. If an MEP wants to hear from you, he'll say, get on the Eurostar, come to, well, I probably wouldn't bother with the UK anymore, but get on a train somewhere or a plane, come over to meet me in my office, we'll have a cup of coffee and you can explain your concerns. Maybe on that basis, the EU could justify paying people travel expenses. That's not really what these groups are doing. It's not about the lobbying. It's about the campaigning. It's about changing public opinion, about being in the media constantly, hammering home the same messages about climate change or pesticides or agriculture or whatever these people are campaigning on. And the EU isn't actually balancing things out. It's really putting its thumb on the scale in one direction. And as I say, it's not just wasteful, it's undemocratic.
Are there any instances of them giving to we might consider more sound organisations? Obviously, the IEA doesn't take government money, but if we did, we work in that world where we're trying to change the climate of opinion to pull things in a sort of free market, more liberal direction. And assuming that the EU Commission doesn't really give money to sort of sound free market think tanks
funny enough, well, not the soundest ones like ours, but actually the EU, amongst the many beneficiaries of its largesse, are think tanks. So every MEP grouping gets a certain amount of money for some of its favoured think tanks. So there are kind of state-funded think tanks across Europe, but obviously groups like the IEA would say we're not going to take the money because it's immoral, which it is. But it's another example of how the EU just wants to have its finger in every single pie, wants to have relationships with these people. And it's so ironic that, if you get privately funded think tanks or privately funded individuals or campaign groups, they're immediately presented as being a front group for whoever's given the money. Whereas these NGOs it's in the name, non-governmental, 100% funded by the government, but we're non-governmental. We're independent. Of whom?
But just to go back to a point you made earlier and to try and play devil's advocate a little bit, this money is, we don't know off the top of our heads what the overall bill for this sort of thing is. But there's what we see recently in Westminster, certainly, is an increase in sort of British DOGE equivalent campaigns. The Spectator's got one, I think Guido's running one. There's a few different Twitter accounts. I think the bloke who runs Brewdog is starting one as well.
Really?
Which does a lot of really important and good work, which is going through government spending and contracts and shining a light on it, which is great. But it pales, the amount that's paid in comparison to the size of the welfare bill, for example.
Well, everything does. You can't use that as a justification for not reforming things.
No, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't. But in terms of where we should be focusing our attention, is there not an argument that we should actually be saying, no, this is good work, but really what we need to be focused on is more Milley-esque afuera and just actually chopping off bits of the state?
Well, that's basically what I'm suggesting, and that's what DOGE is doing. It's chopping off. They're not like having a review of every spending priority of USAID. They're just saying USAID is gone. Now, with that, because it's a very unsubtle approach, there will be damage caused, no doubt, because these groups are not by any means completely useless, doing nothing whatsoever. But I don't see how else you can do it, because otherwise what you get is a process like David Cameron's Bonfire of the Quangos, in which you have a big list of things, and then you send out bureaucrats to go have a word with the people who work for them, and they make a very emotional case for why their particular thing needs to be protected. And so nothing ever changes. It's actually better to take a complete afuera approach and then let the cards fall where they may. And if there are genuinely useful philanthropic things being done, there's no reason why the likes of Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg or anybody else, or even Elon Musk, for the matter, can step in and help them out. But we don't really need things like the Arts Council, and there's no use looking at the Arts Council and say, well, that's not a bad project, or maybe that one can go. It's not going to work. You just need to ditch it all, afuera.
Then how far do you go? How far do you afuera? How far does the chainsaw ride up? If you get rid of the Arts Council, do you need DCMS?
Yeah, we've said for years, haven't we should get rid of DCMS. Why do we need a Department for Culture, Media and Sport? And digital now as well. No, it's nothing but nothing but a nuisance.
Yeah, it all depends on what you think an institution, organization like DOGE is trying to achieve. If you think of this as a way of making the kind of savings that you can see in, say, an OBR report, okay, it's not going to do that because there it really is about the big entitlement programs. But in the case of, say, going back to the sock puppets or the DEY departments examples, I'd say here it's more about, it's not so much the absolute sums of money that they spend, it's more that they use that money to shift the Overton window in the wrong direction, and it's doing more damage. That is probably in the long term causing greater damage.
Because of the indirect effects of their policies are very expensive.
Exactly. Yes. So that's why, even the DEY stuff that I mentioned, I think the total cost, the figures that I've seen, the most recent ones were something like $500 million, and it's generally the case when we talk about government spending that anything which you express in millions rather than billions is a rounding error. In those terms, it doesn't matter. This is not the way to bring down the budget deficit or the debt to GDP ratio. It's not about that. It's really more about not funding destructive and pernicious causes.
There's also an argument as well, and we'll come on to, which takes us into another realm that we want to speak about, but in terms of the more the government does that it shouldn't be doing, the less attention and focus it puts on the stuff it should be doing. So, for example, this week we've seen sort of the escalation of rhetoric, at least, with Trump and Ukraine and Russia. and the talk from the Prime Minister about potentially putting troops in Ukraine, not to fight, but to support peace efforts. Defence is an area in which most people agree, even most sort of liberals and free marketeers and small staters would agree that there is a role for the government to do, but it's arguably doing less of it or not as well because it's focusing on these things. Do you think that doing a solid amount for swearing in these areas would channel money towards things that the government should be doing, law enforcement, national security, defence?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, have you seen you look at the cabinet meetings now, when they've got the full cabinet there. I mean, half of them can't even sit down. You used to have kind of 4 major officers of state, and then you had a few other people doing things like housing and employment and stuff, agriculture maybe. And now you've got a department for everything. I think there's a minister for loneliness and all sorts of things. Every time there's, the newspapers go crazy on some stories like, well, we'll create a new ministry for it, or a new quango for it, or a new department,
or a new commissioner.
And it's most of it's a waste of time because the answer is either obvious or non-existent. And so, of course, you have the government trying to do way, way too much, and it can't do the basic things. And as a result, people are going like, why the hell have we got potholes everywhere? It's such a simple thing to fix, And then, the upper normies, they say, well, potholes actually aren't that important in the great scheme. Well, they are, actually. They're a visible sign of decline. And unlike a lot of, big problems that, smart people want to deal with, they're really easy to fix. It's just a matter of resources, and you get some cement and you fix them and people immediately feel better. I mean, aside from the probably billions of pounds in cost that it imposes on motorists from breaking the suspension and so on. I use that as one example, because there are certain basic things that people complain about, rightly so. My bin collection's gone from 2 weeks to 3 weeks now. And again, people in, metropolitan coffee houses or whatever going like, oh, what's so important about bins? Just use less rubbish. I'll create less rubbish. These are things that we want the government to do for us. Defence is another thing that we need government to do for us. Apart from the most extreme libertarians, everybody believes that the government should be paying to have an army. I'm not convinced we need to massively increase the scale of the army in order to have a war in Russia myself, but we'll see what happens. The simple answer to your question is we try and do, as a government, we try and do way too much. We get involved in every little issue, and it's got worse, I'm sure, in the age of social media, where you can't have a single accident, tragedy, or problem happen without some new law. Look at this ridiculous law on knives we just got. What's it called, Ronan's Law or something? I mean, it's a golden rule that any law that has somebody's name in it is going to be a waste of time, if not counterproductive. The idea that we can stop people getting a hold of sharp knives is just so insane. I mean, where do you begin?
What does it take, though? So I've been in government for a brief time, and I've seen the pressure. I felt the pressure, frankly, from something bad happens, and immediately the overwhelming pressure. Especially, I was in departments at the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, where something horrible happens, and the demands come. You need to do X, you need to do Y, and a lot of the time it's new laws. A lot of the time it's spend a certain amount of money. It's set up a new commissioner for something. What does it take to, in a world of social media and 24-hour rolling news, etc., to have it takes quite a lot of bravery, presumably, from politicians to be able to stand up and say, actually, no.
Yeah, and that was the thing. One of Thatcher's ministers in the early days, can't remember which one, was asked at the press conference, what are you planning to do about such and such? And their answer was nothing. That's not the national government's job. And I think if a politician did that today, saying this isn't our problem, this is for civil society or maybe local governments or somebody else to deal with, there would be a public backlash. But if you had a few examples of that sort and say defenders in the media, opinion multipliers, opinion formers, some people saying, okay, this may sound superficially heartless, cruel, standoffish, this person doesn't care about us, but actually, is this really what the national government should be doing? And say defend that approach, this could become more of a thing. Of course, somebody has to start, and it's more of a coordination problem. I'm guessing behind closed doors, politicians will probably often say, well, maybe we shouldn't be involved in this area. Maybe this isn't something that we can realistically do well. But then there's the coordination problem that if you're the first one who says, no, we're not going to do anything, you will get attacked, including by people who secretly maybe agree with you, but it's just, I don't know what you would do about it. Maybe they need a non-aggression pact to just list a couple of things that they're just saying where we're not going to get involved in that, and then also maybe just explain why. Then
I don't think you even need to do. It's not that you need to go out and explain we're not going to do anything about this and why. You just don't say anything at all. You know, if you're asked about it, say, well, it's a very sad state of affairs, and we hope it doesn't happen again, or whatever it might be. But yeah, we've got enough laws, but I mean, don't go out of your way to talk about these issues, because the news cycle moves on really, really quickly. Who can even remember why we're having a football regulator? Do you remember? There were two kind of news stories at the time. Do you remember?
It was. I think it's a combination of Bury going down,
yes,
and then the European Super League,
yes,
both of which are not problems anymore.
Well, maybe people in Bury might disagree with
that.
Yes,
true, but in terms of just to go down that tangent slightly, the football club is now resurrected, and
is it?
And the and the as an IEA report pointed out, the amount of football clubs that have gone under and disappeared in the past 200 years is vastly minor in comparison to normal businesses. And the European Super League famously didn't get off the ground.
Yeah, because people don't want it. The fans didn't want it. But I mean, well done. You got them both right. I bet a lot of people. We are in a policy-driven world, obviously. The IEA. Most people wouldn't remember what it was. But at the time, for a few days, it was a really big deal. And Boris Johnson was there going like, I'm not going to allow this European Super League damn. And if he just ignored it, everyone
that's a fair point. Often these you get these waves of moral panic, public hysteria or something, and quite often, I guess, if you're involved in the political process, it may feel like this is the new zeitgeist, this is here to stay, and then half a year later nobody can even remember it. So I guess even net zero falls into that category, because it was clearly passed under the impression of, well, we saw this here, 2019. We had an Extinction Rebellion protest here basically every day. It felt as if the whole of Westminster was full of these people. And I'm guessing if you're, say, a conservative politician, you probably feel the whole country is against you, because you see this all the time, and there's a lot of media echo, and it was just a panic reaction to a pandering to that perceived zeitgeist. And the trouble is, just once you have it in law, it's not going to go away. And whereas the movement itself may fade, it's usually the case with these movements. So especially leftist movements often have this fairly rapid turnover. So they suddenly come out of nowhere and are absolutely massive. So BLM, I think most people probably never heard of them until 2020. Suddenly they are everywhere. They are all over the news. Everybody cites them. Everybody holds them up as great role models. And then they just deflate after 2 years. But the trouble is just if you bring in legislation during such a time when they seem to be really dominating the national conversation, well, the legislation isn't going to deflate in the same way in which the organization does.
Yeah, that's hard cases make bad law is really the guiding rule, isn't it? You shouldn't legislate in haste or as a result of public pressure. Take your time and think about it.
And if any government ministers are ever looking for voices to support them in saying no, that's not a job for the government, then we are readily available at 2 Lord North Street. One of the things that is creeping up the agenda in terms of something that should be done, something must be done about manufacturing in the UK, steel production and other such things, as the rising spectre of war continues in Ukraine and Russia. So again, strong talk about sending troops to support in Ukraine has triggered the likes of Nigel Farage and many others to say, well, we can't do that here in the UK because we've outsourced all of our manufacturing. We can't make any steel. We don't have any chemical production, etc. Should we be reindustrializing Britain, do we think, Chris?
In a sense, yes, because I think what Farage was saying was that we are not manufacturing as much as we could or should be doing because we've got various government-imposed restraints, net zero being the obvious one. I mean, I'm no expert on this, but I believe I'm right in saying that Tata Steel would still be going if it weren't for the carbon trading scheme and the various limits on emissions, which the UK has to follow and China doesn't. We have a very high cost of electricity in this country, which is pretty important for a lot of manufacturing processes. So insofar as the inputs have been made artificially expensive by government policy, yes, we should be doing more manufacturing. Is there anything great about manufacturing per se, and should we bring it back in a kind of 19th century sense? No, not at all. We actually manufacture a lot more than people think we do. We just don't employ that many people to do it, which is generally the root of prosperity. I think for quite a few manufacturing jobs, very few people would actually want to have them. Nobody really wants to go back down the mines, as much as some people have romanticized it since Thatcher's day. We have outsourced a lot of this, often for good reasons, but in some instances because these perfectly viable businesses cannot survive because of people like Ed Miliband. So we should get rid of a lot of these so-called protections and environmental laws, not all of them. And people can sensibly disagree or agree about things like carbon trading schemes. But it doesn't make any sense to me to be outsourcing heavy industry just so the UK can feel better about its own carbon emissions, because obviously global warming by definition is a global problem, and it's doing nothing but reducing employment and reducing productivity in this country. And theoretically, I suppose, I think Farage's point is one of basically steel security or something, presumably. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're going to have a problem buying steel from other countries. The question is whether we should actually have to. Probably we don't.
So it's less about top-down reindustrializing by government choosing things. It's actually stop reindustrializing, i.e. stop lifting barriers to a market operating properly.
So that Farage speech, initially it sounded very much like as if there was a kind of manufacturing romanticism, heavy industry romanticism of the kind that you would otherwise maybe have expected from Arthur Scargill in the 1980s. But then he quickly shifted to a critique of net zero. So it could well be that for him, he is simply weaponizing this popular sentiment of popular nostalgic attachment to heavy industries as a vehicle to bash net zero. And if that does the job, then I would say, why not? It's just, I wouldn't have done it in this way. I would just go straight to a critique of net zero rather than talk about specific industries. And because it could well be, so say if we got rid of net zero, if we had a more sensible energy policy, if we had, so this explosion in industrial electricity costs, that's a relatively recent thing. Getting that back to normal levels wouldn't mean that we would have the CO2 emissions of China suddenly. So this is all something that can be done. And if that at the margin means that the manufacturing sector, some heavy industries are doing better than they're doing now, then that's great. But I just wouldn't do it specifically for that reason. And I wouldn't promise to anyone that if we got rid of net zero, if we had cheaper energy, that we would be somehow able to go back to an industrial structure that as we had in 1980. Yeah, exactly. So it could well be that the main result of that would really be that we get more data centers, because they're very energy intensive as well, that it is really industries of a very different kind that nobody has a particularly romantic image about. And it could well be that is the result. By the way, if that's the way to make a critique of net zero socially acceptable, then I'm all for it. I would just do it directly. I wouldn't try to find any socially acceptable entry route. I would just say straight away, well, we should never have done this. And it was born, as I said, out of a moment of a conservative government thinking, oh, we're on the wrong side of history. Everyone is against us and we have to somehow make amends for our evil ways and give this environmentalist movement half of what they want or more. And that's where this comes from now.
And I'm afraid on that bombshell, to pardon the pun, that's all we've got time for. But thank you for joining us on the IEA podcast. We will be back next week with the same discussions on different topics with the same ideas. Until then, thank you very much.